Welcome to Club Book with Hanif Abdurraqib. I'm Andrea Swenson. I'm a music journalist in the Twin Cities, previously with The Current, host of their local show and host of the Prince podcast and author of several books about Minnesota music. I am so excited to be here tonight talking to Hanif. Before I introduce tonight's guest properly, allow me a moment to tell you a bit more about the unique series that is bringing him to us. Club Book is a program of MELSA, the Metropolitan Library Service Agency, made possible through Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and coordinated by Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. Washington County Library is the co-organizer of this evening's talk. Thanks also to partnering bookseller Red Balloon Bookshop. A purchase link to There's Always This Year and Hanif's other books will be available in the comments section of this live stream feed. Have it shipped, pick it up at their lovely store in St. Paul, or have them deliver it personally to your door if you're close to the area. One final housekeeping note, also in the comments, you'll see a survey link. MELSA would greatly appreciate hearing what you think of this Club Book program. It's quick and easy. Our guest tonight, Hanif Abdurraqib, is an incisive poet, accomplished essayist, and versatile cultural critic. His acclaimed poetry collections include The Crown Ain't Worth Much, a raw meditation on the dangers of being young and Black in the American Midwest, and A Fortune for Your Disaster, which explores the themes of loss and rebuilding after heartbreak. Music aficionados may know Abdurraqib best for his essay collection, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, a modern cultural touchstone that led NPR to herald him as one of the most essential voices of his generation. His follow-ups include Go Ahead in the Rain, an homage to the seminal rap group, A Tribe Called Quest, and National Book Award finalist A Little Devil in America in praise of Black performance. His latest book, There's Always This Year on Basketball and Ascension, straddles and defies literary genres. Publishers Weekly lauds, the narrative works as if by alchemy, forging personal anecdotes, sports history, and cultural analysis into a bracing contemplation of the relationship between sports teams and their communities. We're going to take some time to do an interview, and then we will get to an audience Q&A, so you can drop your questions in the comments thread here on Facebook, and our tech manager will route them to me. You can also send a message to Club Book through Facebook Messenger or email clubbookmn@gmail.com. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Hanif Abdurraqib to the conversation.
Thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for taking some time out of your evening to spend with us.
This is such a treat. I'm so excited to talk to you. So I thought I would like to start by talking about this idea of genre. As I mentioned, your latest book in particular really bust out the walls of genre when it comes to literary works. And I wanted to share a quick anecdote. I stopped into a bookstore to pick up a copy of this book to give to a friend, and the shop owner and I spent quite a while trying to figure out what category of the store your book would be in. And we eventually found it in the biography section, which I thought was interesting. And I came to your work, initially through my interest in reading music criticism. And even then, early on in your career, you were already pushing out the boundaries of what it means to write about music and to bring in, personal anecdotes and all of these kind of contextual elements. So I would love to hear from you your inspiration for really pushing the walls of genre when it comes to writing. Do you take any leads from other authors, musicians, other, disciplines? Like, what inspires you to really just kind of expand the possibilities of the kind of writing that you're doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have any kind of formal training in writing at all. I didn't study it. I wasn't great in school, and all these things that I think people have access to that sometimes project a series of rules onto them. I just didn't have that. And so what that did mean was that I was operating with my experience, and is particularly coming up as, I think, a Black person in America, being a people of an oral tradition. And so when you think about the oral tradition, that it defies genre almost entirely. You know, my first book, there's a series of poems in the voice of my barber, and that was almost transcription. I mean, those were just his words because, and I wanted those poems in that book for a reason, to kind of show people an example of how I come from a lineage of poets who aren't published and they aren't writing in a sense, but they're speaking, and through their speaking, they are speaking poetically. They are speaking in these big waves of personal narrative. They're tying all of these things together, and so that, in a way, was my school. And I thought, you know, it's important to kind of honor that. It's important to honor where I come from, and my experience in the world that operates really broadly outside of genre. And so, yeah, I mean, there are folks I love like Maggie Nelson, who defies genre in some really large ways, like Fred Moten. Like, there are a lot of people I love on the page who are doing things. Operate Doug Kearney, who's right there in Minneapolis and Twin Cities. Um, but I also think that it never occurred to me when I started writing poems, which came much after I started writing music criticism. It never occurred to me that the two things had to be entirely different. It actually occurred to me that any kind of criticism or critical thought is enhanced by the approach that poetics affords us, which is the pursuit of beautiful language.
Hmm. I was going to ask about that. What came first for you, the prose or the poetry? The poems came later.
Much later, yeah, I was writing music criticism with real regularity in the late 2000s up until the early 2010s. And then around 2011, I began to get kind of backlash about my work. Editors wouldn't take it. They said it was too quote unquote, too poetic and too meandering. And I didn't know what that meant because I didn't study poems in high school or anything. So I didn't really understand the logic of that. And so my impulse to get into poems was only to figure out how to hone this skill that I was told was that was a fault. That was something that my work is being derided for. My thought process was like, well, if I just get really good at poems, if I hone this thing, then I can maybe do this better. And that was my goal. I never really wanted it. It's funny that a poetry book came first because that wasn't really a dream of mine until
Too
it was, of course.
too poetic is such an interesting insult.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because now I don't think that it was very much a sign of the times, I think, very much like a sign of the early tens, um, an approach to criticism that wanted to remove the critic. Because if you remove the critic as a person, if you say the critic has no actual humanity, then you do get to maintain the role of the critic as someone who sits on high and tells you below what is good, what is not good, what you need. And that's just never been my approach to the critical experience and experiment. Um, I think criticism for me is like the work of seeking. And I think the work of seeking requires people who are willing to seek alongside you. And therefore, the writing becomes kind of a lighthouse or a beacon asking people to kind of come with you somewhere. And I think it's hard to do that if you're sitting on high and dictating. But I also do think there was a long point, where that was the role of the critic. And so in order for that role to be effective, you do have to say, let's keep the personal out of it because you don't get to be seen as a person by the people you're dictating to.
Did you ever try to write that way, like from a more removed or authoritative standpoint?
No, I just can't do it. I think again, I think I write because I write how I speak, and because so much of my early critical experience was, I came up on the punk scene in the Midwest at a time when zines were very big, and I know zines are big again now, but I mean, back then they were big in a way where every punk scene had their own individual zine, but not a lot of people wanted to write in them. People just kind of wanted them, and so my earliest writing was writing in this zine out of the Central Ohio punk scene, and that was like reporting work, essentially reporting on the state of the scene, what shows came through, all this kind of stuff. And even that was hard for me to operate at a remove because I was telling a story of witness. I was telling a story of it's almost like I'm not the most religious person in the world at all, certainly, but it is almost like asking a preacher to um, operate at a remove, to remove themselves entirely from the experience of witness and manifestation of witness. So at no point, I think it just wasn't in my DNA, and I couldn't find it. I think there's some critics who have that and find it, and I just don't.
Yeah. That's so interesting to me because I feel like a lot of what conversation around becoming a writer is about is finding your voice and the process of finding that voice. And it sounds to me like you've always just had it.
Maybe. I mean, yeah, I think you have it and you hone it. You hone it through, I mean, poetry helped me hone my voice in a big way and still does. I mean, I still think that I probably was always a poet impulsively and just didn't have language for it or didn't have I didn't really take writing seriously until I was like in my early 20s. And so there's a way though that I think I was always thinking in the shape of a poem or thinking through things poetically or in the form of poetics. But I didn't have um, I didn't really have the ability to name that or do anything with that. And so, yeah, I do, but I think many writers have the voice and then they spend a lifetime honing it.
Mm. Yeah. Do you remember your first poem, what it was about?
Yeah, actually, my first poem was when I was in middle school, when I was in seventh grade or sixth grade. I wrote seventh. I wrote this poem that was critical of Jackie Robinson, weirdly, and I think, well, was it? It was critical of. This is actually interesting because I actually don't think my politics have moved this far away from that. It was more critical of the American imagination that propped up only Jackie Robinson and no one else. And it's because I had my dad had showed me this, and I got in trouble for it in school. I'll never forget that. I think my dad was very proud though. My dad showed me this documentary on Negro League baseball, and so I learned about like Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige, and at that point, again in seventh grade, I hadn't heard of those. I didn't know anything about those guys at all. Like I thought like Jackie Robinson was the only black baseball player. And so I had this kind of disappointment almost. And so I wrote this very critical poem about Jackie Robinson in the early baseball. My teacher was very unhappy with me. But my father was very pleased.
Wow. Um, that's fascinating. So I'm curious to talk a little bit more about the new book, the latest book. There's always this year. There's so much to dig into with this book because there's so many layers to it and you cover so much ground and the structure is fascinating. So I kind of want to break up all the things I want to know about it. But the thing that struck me immediately from the opening pages is that you create the sense of intimacy with the person that you're talking to as you're writing. You're literally saying like, I'm taking your hand, I'm putting a hand on your shoulder. It's physical, it's like visceral as you're reading that you're being welcomed in. When you're writing something like this, are you picturing the reader in your mind?
Uh, Maybe, or I'm picturing like a broad cluster of what a reader could be. Mostly though, I'm more or less breaking, I'm picturing a wall that requires breaking down. And to maintain that tone throughout the book was challenging. To keep returning to these direct addresses was challenging, but you can't to open the book as I did, and maybe now is a good time to read. I'll just read the opening bits so that people get a sense of what you mean. And I won't read for too long. I'll just read for a couple of minutes.
Read as long as you want. I love this whole intro.
You will surely forgive me if I begin this brief time we have together by talking about our enemies. I say our enemies and know that in the many worlds beyond these pages, we are not beholden to each other in whatever rage we do or do not share. But if you will, please imagine with me. You are putting your hand into my open palm and I am resting one free hand atop yours. And I am saying to you that I would like to commiserate here and now about our enemies. And you will know then, at least for the next few pages, my enemies are your enemies, but there's another reality to talk about. Our enemies, there's another reality. To talk about our enemies is also to talk about our beloveds, to take a windowless room and paint a single window through which the width and breadth of affection can be observed, to walk to that window together, if you will allow it, and to say to each other, how could anyone cast any ill on this? And we will know then, collectively, that anyone who does is one of our enemies. And so I've already led us astray. You will surely forgive me if I promised we would talk about our enemies when what I meant was that I want to begin this brief time we have together by talking about love. And you will surely forgive me if an enemy stumbles their way into the architecture of affection from time to time. It is inevitable, after all, but we know our enemies by how foolishly they trample upon what we know as affection, how quickly they find another language for what they cannot translate as love. So to think about the structure of the first page, even, that was just the first page, you can't, and to extend upon the metaphor of taking down the fourth wall, it's a literal wall, you can't kind of like take one brick out the wall and then turn away from it entirely and never return to it and give people only a half glimpse of what you want to do. You have to kind of take that wall down gradually throughout the book, which did lead to all of those kind of returns to that approach of saying, I'm still here with you and you are still here with me. And I did that for a lot of reasons. One reason is because I wanted to build an emotional rhythm within the context of the book. But another important reason is that I understand that the book is kind of attempting, like a lot of my books, attempting to tie together a lot of ideas and elements. And it works best, I think, if people believe that they are being guided. I wanted to offer people autonomy to find what they wanted in the book, but every now and then, every 50 pages or so, I did want to say, we're still here together because I am figuring this out as you are. Like I'm still kind of wandering through the weeds of this as you are, and we are doing it together. And that means that we are perhaps responsible for an outcome together. And so that's the kind of approach. And yeah, I mostly didn't want to open the book with that level of fourth wall breaking and that level of intimacy and then turn away from it entirely. And so I knew I had to kind of sustain that rhythm throughout the entirety of the pages, which is challenging but worthwhile, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, it just pulls you along for this ride that you go on with you as you work through all of these different layers. It's fascinating to me. It almost reminds me of like watching Fleabag when she glances at the camera.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Like,
mean, and honestly, I watched a lot of, I engaged in so much media that involved that. Not just the books of like Ross Gay or Mary Oliver, who both do that very well, but also like Fleabag, and also like a lot of old shows, like a lot of old films, like black and white films or silent films, where I watched a lot of silent films where things did have to be communicated through looks and through these kind of intimate turns towards the camera, because I was trying to understand how to balance that well. And also the thing that happens in season 2 of Fleabag, where like she breaks the fourth wall. We get used to the breakage of the fourth wall all through season 1 as something that only exists in her universe. But then in season 2, like the dude, like the priest or whatever, can see it. He can, like, he interprets it. That is actually the goal, I think. The goal is to say, for me at least in the writing of the book, I honed in on that and thought, if you do this enough and do it with enough effectiveness, people will feel like they are now on your side. And then collectively, we're all turning to those who are not on our side and saying, come join us over here. And so that was also an important thing. Yeah, Fleabag played a slight role in that.
huh, interesting. I'm really drawn to the way that you throughout the book describe our people, my people, the people that are on your side, and then the enemies. But it's a very expansive, inclusive group of people that keep being brought into who your people are. I'm wondering,
Yeah.
like, what does that term mean for you?
Well, I will also say that it's because that is actually a response to the fact that the term enemy is used very broadly in the book, because I wanted to be self-indicting in some ways, to say that like I have been my own enemy at points. There are points in the book where I'm pointing at myself and saying, there's that point in the book where I talk about my PO, my probation officer, who uh who said something like, you know, you've got a good heart, but the decision making isn't there. And I thought that, and for some reason back then, I thought that was like a compliment. And he was like, no, my guy, like this is not. And I think about that all the time, in the way that I was so far gone down the route of being my own enemy that I could not process someone trying to steer me back towards a better place. And so in order to say, there are points in this book where my father presents as enemy, but I love him deeply. There are parts of this book where I present as my own enemy, but I am required to love myself with some depth. To expand the definition of enemy, to make it an indicting thing, and also not make it a binary thing where it's like, if you are an enemy, I don't love you. And I grew that through the book, because to open the book, I'm like, here are directly who our enemies are, and we cannot love these people. And then as the book goes on, it's like, wait a minute, to name an enemy is also to build a kind of mirror, to say, like, I don't want to be that, and I want to be this. And then you have to watch yourself become that at points. You have to watch yourself become that which you've designated to be the traits of an enemy. And you have to find a way to love yourself regardless. And so much of designating who my people were, who am I aspiring to be when I turn towards the mirror? I think the good version of myself. But it is also acting in response to my broadening the scope of enemy as a term.
Yeah. Well, and I think it works well with in the context of talking about sports too, because there is this kind of like fluctuating group of people that come together behind teams, but they might not have anything to do with each other except for they're all rooting for this team, and then they're rooting against this other team. But yeah, I just thought it was a really kind of a brilliant through line of on the surface, you could be just talking about, who you're rooting for, but it's actually about like building those connections with each other as like human beings.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's so great that you caught, because it is all using a framework of sports, like where I'm a fan. I know I'm a Timberwolves, like a massive Timberwolves fan. I have been my whole life, largely. And was it last season? I think last season I go to a handful of Timberwolves games every year, and I went to the Timberwolves opening game in Toronto. Maybe it was 2 seasons ago, I don't remember. They played in Toronto to open the season, and I went. It was 2 seasons ago because Kat was still on the team. I remember that. And I went, and now I think at this stage of my life, thankfully, surely, enough people, and I have so much gratitude for this, enough people read my work so that every now and then someone will be like, oh, you're the guy who wrote that thing. And so I was at the Timberwolves game, and I'm a very vocal and noticeable Timberwolves fan, I think. And I was sitting at the game in Toronto, and and these Raptors fans recognized me. And the Timberwolves played horrible that night. They lost by like 25, and they were heckling me the whole time and like getting on me. And the minute we walked outside, and I was, I took it. That's the way it is. Your team's getting smoked. You might have to hear something. I get it. I totally get it. So I had no hard feelings, and we walked outside. The minute we walked outside the arena, one of them was like, hey, man, I got your book in my car. Like, if we walk, will you sign it for me? And it was this perfect example of how sports does turn the heart towards this very wonderful in some ways and not wonderful in other ways, like binary thinking of friend versus enemy. And then the minute you step outside that arena, it's like completely complicated and more complex and more affectionate in a lot of ways. And so I was also thinking about that. I was working on the book when that happened, and I thought that was very funny.
Oh, I love the Timberwolves connection. I will say the most nervous part about getting ready to interview you is that I don't know very much about basketball.
Yeah.
But I read this book and loved every word of it. And I don't really understand a lot about, the different layers of like, just, following teams and like who's doing what and who's done what, but it didn't matter. I'm wondering if you've heard from other readers that maybe came to your work through other, topics that you've written about and have found this book and maybe even got interested in basketball because of it.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, well, one thing, but you do definitely understand fandom because of the field you operate in, right? Like, so, and not just, I don't mean that just from like a bird's eye, like, who's your favorite musician of all time?
Prince.
Right. And so like you understand to some and I think Prince fans are unique in this sense, really, because I am one of them. You understand to this very real degree the lengths that fandom will allow you to go to, where it's like, there was that point where they opened up the house and let people tour it or whatever, and I like flew across the country to do that for Prince, you know what I mean? And so that part of my heart is not at all misaligned from the part of my heart that loves the Timberwolves, or the part of my heart that loves Columbus, Ohio, or, and I think actually I did hear from folks about this, mostly because here's the thing. This book, to say it's about basketball is kind of like a myth, that's a selling point. But when I was a kid, I loved this fantasy writer named Lloyd Alexander. And he has this short story about this magical lake. And anyone who walks to the lake and looks in the lake sees the thing they most want reflected back to them. So if a boy wants to be king, he walks to the lake and looks in the water and he sees himself in a crown. If someone wants to be a farmer, they walk to the lake, look in the lake, they see themselves on a farm. I wanted to make this book feel like that. And so if you are just like a straight up hoops fan, like hardcore hoops fan, you're going to probably read this book and be like, this is a basketball book. But if you want to read about mortality and loss, you'll find that in this book. If you want to read about the complicated nature of parent and child relationships, you'll absolutely find it. If you want to read a book about place, you'll find it. But I also think what draws a lot of people to this book is the examination of what it is to love something. And I hope that my work does that broadly. Like, I think my work is orbiting, at least my nonfiction work. My poetry work is a little different in some ways, but my nonfiction work is orbiting what it is to do an examination, to have to put close attention on an obsession. And so I've been so excited because when this book came out, I was like, I don't know if people who love my work are going to find anything in this book for themselves. But I think that goal, the kind of Lloyd Alexander exercise, came to fruition, where people was like, I found all kinds of things in this book. And yeah, some of it was basketball. I think I did make a couple basketball fans out of people. But I think that's just a byproduct maybe of saying, I'm so excited about this thing. And wouldn't you like to maybe see if you could feel excited about it too?
I think that absolutely comes across. And I've had that feeling when I do go to certain like sporting events here. If there's like a Prince night at the
Yeah.
game or something, and everyone gets really excited because the game's going well. I'm like, oh, it is kind of like being at a rock show. Like everyone is like crescendoing together, and there is something like communal and exciting about that, even though I don't know like the stats of that guy or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think about this all the time because the bridge between music fandom and sports fandom. I feel like, and I mean, I'm so deep in music fandom, as I'm sure you are, and so you know the kind of intensity and nerding out that can happen. And I feel like that happens in sports circles in ways that are similar in terms of affection and approach. I'm less interested in the nuance. Like I'm not a big sports. I love sports deeply, but like I'm not like reading advanced stats. Like I don't in the same way that I'm listening for like Kate Bush production techniques. I'm not doing that on the sports end with that equivalent. But I do love, because in this book there's also music. Like I don't think I could ever write a book without writing about music. You know, there's a whole thing about like the function of the begging song and Otis Redding and Boys to Men and all this stuff. And I think about how my excitements intertwine. And it would be almost treasonous in a way to write a book about anything. You know, for me at least, to say like this book is about one thing. That would be a real failure, I think, of the way my brain works.
Yeah. I love the way you wrote about Otis being a little bit behind the beat. I'd never thought about that before, and it made me want to
Yeah.
study that song. And yeah, that was great. So I wanted to ask about, we got some audience questions about this too. The actual structure and kind of outline of the book is modeled after a basketball game. And you've got this device running throughout where there's this clock counting down each chapter, and it drives the book. It makes you constantly go to the next section and provides these really interesting little vignettes. How did you come up with that idea? And then how did you execute it?
Well, normally in my first drafts, I do this thing where whenever I'm writing a book, I write like 30,000 words and then start again, mostly because I'm teaching myself how to write the book. And so in that kind of block, in that 30,000 word block, sorry, my dog is excitedly breathing heavy and coming into the, it's very nosy. In that first 30-word block, I know, buddy. In that first 30,000 word block, the countdown clock only existed in the beginning in the pregame shape. And then I abandoned it. But then I had a moment where I was like, that also doesn't make sense. Much like I was talking about, like, you can't take one brick out of the wall. It's kind of like you can't introduce that trick or that function and then say, now we're going to leave it alone forever. And so I had this real crisis where I became so aggressively beholden to the countdown clock that I was struggling. And then I talked to a poet friend of mine, and he said this thing where it's like, you're being governed by the clock and not the language. So you actually need to write the language and then map that device onto it, which was so much easier and more fun for me because then I could play with things like pace and line breaks and all of these things and do the like jokey inside nudges where it's like the whole section on wishing begins at 11:11, and the section about the King James Bible verses takes the Bible verse and uses that chapter verse as the time clock. And what I wanted to do, which was very intentional for me, was to create a sense. You can't teach people how to read your work in your voice, but you can teach people how to read your work in terms of the pace you want them to read it at. And I wanted to create these moments in the book that were urgent and like that speed up the heart rate, but are also demanding close attention. There's that moment in the book where I'm talking about Dick Snyder's shot in Cleveland. And that was a really hard thing to nail down because I'm trying to describe a shot, but more importantly, I'm trying to pull off maybe I'll read, I don't know, I don't want to take up too much time reading because I know we have audience questions. So maybe I won't read that.
You have plenty of time to read if you want.
Okay. I'll read like an abbreviated version of it because, okay. And there's a YouTube video of this shot. I would recommend watching it because I really love it. Yes, okay. In sports movies, each second lasts longer than it should. It's a trick of building anticipation, asking a viewer to suspend disbelief as the camera cuts to the clock, back to the slow motion shot of a player with a ball in their hand running toward an open space or ascending toward a hoop. We know better, but we're willing to be fooled for what the act of being fooled can add to the experience. I mention this to say that rarely does a moment like this happen in a real life game for me, a moment that feels so slow that it seems as if I am not actually in control of my own watching of it. I watch the Dick Snyder shot like this. The small window of 8 seconds it takes for the shot to happen, it happens in small acts or movements the way a play or a dance might. In the first act, Snyder catches an inbound pass from Jim Clemens, 5 seconds left. In the second act, Snyder gently fakes a pass to his right, causing the defender to open up his body just enough. Of the many things I love about basketball, I most love to consider it as a duel of ankles, a defender and an opponent locked together in a lightless chamber, both seeking a window cracked and begging for them to slide through. And there, in the moment where Snyder's left side was opened up, just a small sigh of light tumbling out, he sprinted toward it, leaving his defender 2 steps behind and even catching the other Bullets players in the paint slightly off guard and scrambling. And then in the final act, the shot itself feels more spectacular to me than it is. I've built a fascination through repetition, like when you repeat a single word so many times that the word itself begins to mean both nothing and everything, a treasure chest of colliding sounds. Snyder shoots a floater over the outstretched arm of a defender. It hits the backboard and it goes in, and the Cavs win the series. Wait, let's try this again. Snyder takes off from 1 foot right above the dotted circle. He jumps, yes, but it is unfair to say that he is in the air. He appears to be in the midst of a type of controlled flailing, like a young bird dropped out of its nest from the beak of a mother, demanding that it learn to fly. Snyder's legs kick out awkwardly as he flings his arm past the defender who foolishly arrived too late. The ball is almost secondary. Okay, let's pause here and try again. This is where everything slows down, the way it might if the scene were stitched together by an overzealous director. The ball is not secondary. Of course it isn't. I have simply fallen again for the romantics of the body's movements. The ball moves in slow motion. I know exactly when and where to force the scene into stillness. There's a moment when the ball hangs in the air before it kisses the sweetest spot of the backboard, the spot that anyone who has shot a basketball enough knows, the spot that breathes the ball in before blowing it gently through the net. Before that, the ball is frozen in the miniature heaven of Richfield. And if you can freeze the frame just right, if you can catch it at the exact moment the ball begins to ascend, which I can, which I have, and since we are talking about setting suns in their downward tumble anyway, you will see the dull orange orb pressed against the blue paint of the sideline. And if you were to watch it enough times, if you were to stare at just this moment for long enough, it might appear to you as a sort of distorted sunset, a sunset from someone else's past, past told to you in a story once, fighting its way to the top of your memory all over again. And of course, it is an optical illusion. The ball is actually far higher than the blue tinted sideline. But then again, every sunset you've ever seen is a trick. Most of the beauty I have surrendered myself to is tucking some far less delicious honesty beneath its magic. And so why not this? The moment when, even if you didn't know the ball was going to go in, you might marvel at what is on the other side of the ball's brief affair with the blue. It's like I was saying, I love a game seven. The sun sets for someone and the sky remains a parade of colors for someone else. So in order to get that whole thing to work, because before that, I like offer up this premise. I introduce the image of a sunset, not to align with a game seven, but just talk about the miracle of sunset. I did that knowing that I would have to get people to stay at that on that shot for long enough to be able to imagine the ball against the light blue sideline of the Ritual Coliseum in 1976. In order to do that, I had to use the trick of repetition. So there's a countdown clock happening, but it's happening in a very slow motion to get you to return and return and return, solely so that you realize that we're staying in this place for a reason, so that by the time I introduce the ball against the sideline, you can say, I get what he's doing here. And then I get to land the plane effectively. And so using the countdown clock allowed me to force people to slow down, even if linguistically I'm building a kind of anticipation and tension. And so I got to do things kind of operating in two modes, which I really loved.
I'm so glad that you read that passage, because so much of the way you describe just the game of basketball feels very cinematic, and that you draw out these moments that if you're just watching it in real time and you don't know what you're seeing, just fly by. I mean, it's a very quick moving game, lots of squeaking tennis shoes, lots of action, but you make me want to study it more because you're seeing the beauty in these movements. When you're watching a game, are you seeing this as it's happening, or are you watching things over and over again to kind of catch these movements?
I tend to watch things over and over. I'm a big archivist and rewatcher of things, of so many things. And because most of the time when I'm watching a basketball game, I'm like shouting at the Timberwolves on TV, or like, now I'm a big WNBA fan too. So just kind of broadly shouting at the television but I'm a big rewatcher of things because there are things you can only catch that, like, for example, that Dick Snyder shot. The reason I relied on repetition as a device is because I really did I've watched that shot so many times, and I wanted to give people the feeling of what it is like in the experience of close attention, paying close attention to something. And so, I mean, it's much like music, we return to music to hear different things in it each time. I've never heard a song I've loved only one time and thought I've gotten all I can out of it.
That's enough. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a very, very, very big Springsteen fan. I'm a huge Springsteen fan. And for much of my life, Born in the USA was one of my least favorite Springsteen albums for a handful of reasons. I mean, I just, the kind of massive turn to pop nature of it. And I think that the production is a bit idiosyncratic, but I had elders, like I know Bruce Springsteen fans who are older than me, and they would always say shit like, once you turn like 38, 35, 40, you're gonna love that album. And I was like, that doesn't seem like it's true. But then I turned 40 and I really do have a different appreciation for this thing I've heard multiple times. And so the idea of returning to something and having it change alongside you is so important to the critical eye and the critical ear and the critical mind and heart. The ability to say, I am willing to change the way I feel because this is requiring it is tapping into a different feeling of mine that I didn't have access to before because I hadn't lived long enough, or I hadn't gone to enough places, or I hadn't seen enough of the world. All that stuff is so important. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that I've been able to and so sports is no different. Like, sports is not different to me at all. Things transform when you stare at them.
I've been thinking about that a lot lately because I think a lot about Prince just like every day. And for so long, following him, it was like he was constantly evolving his sound and what he was doing. And there was always something new to look forward to. And now it's like he's stopped changing and the things that he's recorded are just frozen in time, but I'm changing. And my experience listening to it has dramatically changed over the last, 10, 15 years. So it's, I think about that juxtaposition a lot.
And with Prince specifically, you know what's wild? Not that we don't have to do a whole Prince thing, because I know we could, but you know, due to the way that like radio stations were in the 80s, where it was like there was a certain amount of time a song could play in a lot of ways, in a lot of stations like structure. Purple Rain, when it was a hit, the radio cut it off early. You know, like the radio would cut it. So if you and I never thought about this until I was in a room with other people, adults who were around my age, and one of them was like, "Oh, I love how Purple Rain ends. I love that it ends on this big crescendo point with and I was like, yo, that's actually not how it ends. There's like 2 whole minutes after that, and those are important minutes. Those are like very important minutes to the structure of the emotional landscape of the song. Like the thing that happens after the radio, or even I don't know, I don't remember the music video, but definitely the radio. The thing that happens after the radio cuts off Purple Rain is actually the way he lands the plane of that song. It's the whole song. Like that last 2 minutes is massively important. And so it was cool to be like, our hearing is also shaped by the way songs are presented to us. Like I grew up in a radio era, and so I grew up recording songs off the radio. And there are songs that for years I thought were one shape, and then I was like, wait a minute, this is an entirely different shape, you know? And so
Yeah.
I love that too. Like I love that we can alter our own history with listening.
Yeah, me too. I want to make sure we're getting to audience questions, and this one is in line with what we've been discussing. What has been your most memorable or transformative live music experience?
Um, I don't know if I can pick one. I'll pick one that braids together. So I love the band a lot. Every year I watch The Last Waltz on the night before Thanksgiving, and I've done that for 20, this will be the 23rd year, my gosh. Um, and when Levon was not well, I saw the last show that Levon Helm played. Um, and he played a cover of Ralph Stanley band's Gloryland. He was doing that frequently, but tonight, he was really not well. I mean, he was like, Levon played until the end, and he played until like really he was. I think he died like the next week, and he was in the wheelchair, and he was surrounded by he sang with folks, and one of the people he sang with was his daughter Amy Helm, um, and the cover was beautiful. I mean, Gloryland is just. I don't. Do you know that song? Do you know Gloryland?
Yeah.
So beautiful. It's so like if you are a performer who knows you are going to die soon, what better song to end with, And so that was so moving for me and burned into my brain. And then a few years ago, I curate music at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and we had Mavis Staples play, and Mavis Staples wanted Amy and her band to open. And they did this thing, and they were, I mean, Amy's so talented. And they did this thing where they put their instruments down, came to the front of the stage, and they closed with this a cappella version of Gloryland. That was, Amy was kind of like, I'm gonna sing a song for my dad. And it was so moving. Like I was like sobbing. It was so moving. And it made me think about lineage and love, and this idea, like the function of the song Gloryland is essentially to be like, maybe I will see you again and we won't feel any pain. Right. And that's such a memorable, massive bridge performance for me, those two things coming together. So I'll say that today, but I mean, there's endless, I've seen so much music in my life now, to the point where it's hard to get me out of the house, because I've seen, it's a lot. It would take a lot to get me out of the house, but I grew up going to punk shows in basements and seeing bands before they were big and playing these tiny shows, and that's always going to be so memorable to me. And um, yeah, I wish I would have seen the Replacements in the 80s.
Mm.
So people who have
Did you
seen
see
their
the
replacements in the
reunion?
80s, people who've seen their replacements in the 80s are like, depends on which ones you get. Depends on what night.
Did you check out the reunion shows?
No, reunion shows are hard for me. And I know that's like elitist and bad in some ways, but sometimes a reunion show is on some shit where it's like, we really want it, we really want to do it. And other times a reunion show is like a vessel for, we need to do it or whatever. And I don't want to roll the dice. I just never want to roll the dice. I will see some. When My Chemical Romance did their first show back, I flew to LA to see it. And honestly, I was underwhelmed. I was like pretty underwhelmed by it. And it made it like cemented this thing for me where I was like, the reunion show is just such a hard. Now, that said, if say tomorrow David Byrne was like, we're getting the band back together, original lineup, playing in one show only, I would do whatever it took to get there. You know, there are certain bands where I would do it. Like I love the band Pretty Girls Make Graves so much. And when they got back together last year, a couple years ago, I was like, I'll go see it, you know. But the Mats, I was like, I feel like they are such a band of their era and of that moment. Um, I did hear good things about the reunion shows for sure, but it's also I'm a stickler for the reunion show if it's not all original members, and so you know, without stints in it, it's a little tough.
Yeah. Yeah. It was good. But I never saw them, during their heyday. So I didn't have anything to compare it to other
Yeah,
than
for sure.
the recordings. But it felt both like cathartic for them and the crowd, and also like I got to watch other people be very nostalgic about something I'd never experienced before. So it's kind of interesting just from a Minneapolis perspective. Um,
There, I mean, we can talk. We should go more audience questions. But man, we can talk about Minneapolis. I know that I just that's like such an important Minneapolis in the '80s is such an important music scene for me. So many of the bands I love deeply. Husker Du, like you know, Zen Arcade's one of my favorite records of all time. And anyway, more audience questions for sure.
I love Grand Heart so much. So I'm getting some questions about process, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about your writing process too. And specifically, so this person's asking, are you working on multiple manuscripts simultaneously? And I wanted to ask, maybe along the same lines, when you get asked to do things like this tonight, or go to readings, or do promo for your books, how do you balance the external facing demands of being a writer, especially in this era, with actually writing and carving out time to work on your next books?
Yeah, well, I definitely don't work on two manuscripts at once. I can't. I don't know how. I know that some people can. Right now, I'm working on my next poetry book, and I can't even fathom the next nonfiction thing. Like I'm writing essays because I have a job and I'm contributing essays to places, and I'm writing this cool series of album anniversary essays for long reads this year because this year is just such a great. This is such a great year for album anniversaries on the fives and tens. Just this week, literally just this week, it was the 35th anniversary of Heaven or Las Vegas and the 40th anniversary of Hounds of Love, just like back to back days, which is bananas, you know. But so no, I'm only working on one book at a time. But I will say the external facing stuff. So I don't know how well people followed, but I was on book tour for a year, like a whole year, literally a year. I came through the Twin Cities and did a beautiful thing at the library, and but I was on book tour for a year, and Random House would have kept me on book tour, I think, for much longer because the book was selling so well and people were coming out to these things by like the hundreds, and it was so great. And I loved it too. But I hit a point where I was like, I'm not like Fish or Dave Matthews, but like I'm not gonna be on the road for my whole life, you know. I want the work is writing. And so I began writing about music specifically to find people who were as excited about music as I was. I'm the youngest of four, and I grew up in a loving household, but I did spend a lot of time alone because so many people had other stuff going on. And I spent a lot of time alone with music. And it became really isolating for me to think, to put it another way, when I was a teenager, I used to be on these like record collector message boards, you know. This is in the era of like message boards in a big way. And I used to have to lie about my age. I guess I didn't have to, but everyone on the message boards were like, you know, 60, 50, 60-year olds. And I was like 13, 14, and I would lie about my age so that they would take me seriously, you know. And so that when I talked about like, you know, the production on the first Buddy Holly album, they would talk to me about it. And so much of my life, I think I've been reaching for this kind of connection to talk about obsessions in a way that writing has afforded me. And so I have so much gratitude for anything that is puts me in kind of close connection with people who are as excited about something. You know, my book signing lines are, I don't know if anyone watching has been to any of my events, but my book signing lines are like notoriously long, like hours long. And the reason they're so long, and the reason I wouldn't have it any other way, even though like, do I love getting back to a hotel at midnight or 1 a.m. Not always, but I wouldn't have any other way, because one real virtue of the critical mind and heart, I think, is that you have to be more interested in other people than you are in yourself. And so I love these kind of things, because maybe not virtual, it's harder, but in person, I get to ask people what they're excited about, what they're listening to. We get to bond over these things. And to me, that feeds the writing mind, that feeds my heart, that feeds the writing. The writing isn't just producing words on the page. The writing is anything in your actual living world that makes the return to the page easier and more, with more, that you can return to the page with more depth and more heart. And so I balance it because I have deep gratitude for it, but also because I think we're learning from each other.
I love that so much. We had another question about the process specifically for There's Always This Year. Did you write this book and its sections sequentially, or was your organic start someplace in the middle? And this has been a hot topic in their book club conversation recently.
Yeah, actually, I wrote it sequentially, but not in the order. It's in the book used to be backwards. The book used to begin at the end and then post pregame. So the pregame was always what it was, but the first quarter used to be the fourth quarter, and then it ran backwards. And that was just like one device too many. My editor, the great and talented Maya Millette, was like, it had to be very hard to write this. Like, this is a hard book to write it backwards in this way. But then it was like, but you have to also make a good book. Like, you have to, and it wasn't bad, but it was saying like, this is one trick too many. If you have this framework of basketball game, countdown clock, timeouts with poems, all this stuff, the tipping point is asking people to read a narrative from backwards to forwards. But the spirit of the book was, we're counting down. So for me, therefore, it was like, I want to begin as a child on the basketball court and then become something. But that wasn't the best book. It was the hard book. And and to write that was really cool, because I was like, well, if the main edit is turn this book around and then rewrite through it again, that's easy, because I've written the hardest possible version of this book that exists. And this is now easy. And so that was a delight. It was a delight to do that exercise. But I think my editors were correct. You know, you want to, as a writer, I think, I want the reader to enjoy the experience more than I want to satiate my own ego, you know? And I think that there was a draft of this book where I was just satiating my own ego. And I'm thankful for editors to say, people are going to be wanting to love this book, so let's make that easy for them.
Wow. So we talked a lot about Minneapolis tonight, but this question is about your home. Because this book is so rooted in place, did you have any special launch events at home? And more generally, how's it been received there?
Yeah, we did a big thing here. I mean, all my books, in the book publishing world, it's very important to launch your book in New York, to do like your book launch date in New York. But for me, I'm a big hard line, like Columbus is first. And so on Tuesday when the book came out, we did New York, but on Monday, we did a big thing here in Columbus. And the first day of week 2 of tour was Cleveland. And there's been a lot of love here. I mean, like, I love this city very deeply. And also there's been a lot of love because a lot of stories in the book are told. These are untold stories of guys who are from where we're from, guys who didn't quote unquote make it. And so much of the book is trying to redefine what making it means and what it means to be beloved in a place, even if you aren't an NBA star. And so I think there's so much love for the book and how it, I hope, gazes generously on the city that I'm in and the city that people are in. Yeah.
Another question, how did you learn about the National Book Critics Circle Award nod, and what does this kind of laurel actually entail for a writer who is honored?
I was really thankful. Yeah, the National Book Critics Circle Award thing was I don't focus on awards very much. I'm actually I wouldn't say I'm hostile to decoration, but I just don't think about it. I don't care about it. I've never gone, I'm grateful for the fact that I've been nominated for things, but I usually never show up for them, and so the National Book Critics Circle thing was confusing because this book was nominated in 2 categories, which never really happens. This book was a finalist in both nonfiction and criticism. And so I found out about those on back-to-back days. And I remember having to call my editor and be like, what does this mean? Does this mean that and there was this agreement of, you never go to these awards, just please come to one. It was I feel like they were like, please just come to one and then we'll never ask you again for another decade, just please. So I went, and it was a real honor to be there. And I think um, awards are great and meaningful to perhaps someone's legacy, but I'm just not really concerned with my legacy as it defines itself through decoration. And I think um, I'm proudest of the fact that this book was able to reach so many people. But I'm grateful for the National Book Critics Circle Award. I'm glad I got to show up and hang out with other writers I admire and love. That room was so full of writers I adore, and so that was a really wonderful experience.
I know you talked a little bit about the guest editing of the year's best sports writing, but we did get a question about that. And if anything else that you would like to share that you're working on now.
Yeah, gosh, I love working on the year's best sports writing anthology in part because I got to kind of look through the past anthologies and kind of operate, I don't want to say against those, but kind of, I took that so seriously. I was asking myself the question of what kind of work doesn't get represented in these anthologies and what kind of stories and not just what kind of people, like not just looking for a diversity of humans, but looking for a diversity of stories. And so, yeah, there's a piece in there by a WWE superstar about mental health, and there's a piece, and by diversity of stories, I don't just mean like, yes, there's a piece in there about like a trans basketball club in Brooklyn that's really cool, but also just a diversity of sports stories. There's a piece in there about ultimate frisbee that I found by like scouring the internet and I found it on like a literal blog. Like it's just someone's ultimate frisbee blog. And there's a piece in there about chess, and there's a piece in there about ballet, a beautiful essay about an aging ballet dancer coming to terms with her body not being able to do what it used to be able to do. I was like, I thought I wanted to find pieces that would not show up in any other anthology. Like that piece about ultimate would just never be found if someone didn't spend a lot of time on the internet. And I was maybe most overjoyed with the opportunity to say, here are stories about sports that just people don't read about. Like people don't read about sport like ultimate like that. Um, you know, I love that. So yeah, that was a huge thing. In terms of what I'm working on, next poetry collection is really the focus, but I'm also writing about music. I had an essay about Little Brother's album, The Minstrel Show, come out last week because it was the 25th anniversary, 25th, yes. And I have in, I think, 2 weeks, an essay on Groove Theory's first and only album coming out because it is the 30th anniversary. Um, and I'm just, yeah, I think I'm also just like back on the road. It's funny. I had a whole summer to be in my house after being on tour for a year. Had a whole summer to be in my house and just write. And now I'm back on the road again. And though I'm home tonight, I'm back on the road very much. And it's a little joyfully disorienting.
Well, we will let you get back to enjoying being at home with your dog and soaking up all of that
Yeah,
and spending time writing. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was just a total joy to speak with you, and I cannot wait till you write your next book so I can hopefully interview you again.
sure. This was a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time and being so thoughtful. And
Uh,
thanks everyone for watching.
This has been a virtual presentation of Club Book, a long-running literary series of MELSA made possible by the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Special thanks again to Washington County Library for the part they played in bringing Hanif to us. Before you log off, look for the Club Book survey link, which is in the comments and will be projected in place of my video. Last, consider joining Club Book on Monday, September 29th for their next program. This one in person and featuring internationally best-selling mystery, suspense, and romance novelist Nicholas Butler. Nicholas will appear at the Excelsior Library, part of the Hennepin County Library System. Attendance at this in-person program is free, but you must pre-register. Visit clubbook.org for that link and all other series details. Thanks all and have a great night.